Ronald Shaw stood at the railing of his Harbourage penthouse balcony, watching the sunset paint the bay in gold. At 45, he had built a tech security empire from nothing, turning his talent for identifying vulnerabilities into a fortune worth over $100 million. The view before him, like everything else in his life, was meticulously earned, calculated, and controlled. Or so he thought. The cruise documents arrived, Celeste said, sliding open the glass door. His wife of 8 years approached with an envelope in hand, the breeze catching her auburn hair. Ronald turned, studying her smile with newfound suspicion. 2 weeks ago, he'd noticed the first discrepancy, a hotel charge in Redwood, when Celeste had supposedly been at her sister's. A small thing. But in Ronald's world, small vulnerabilities could become catastrophic breaches. 2 weeks on the Adriatic. She continued, running a finger along his jawline. Just what we need. Ronald took the envelope. Sounds perfect. He'd never planned on taking this cruise. The idea had come suddenly from Celeste 3 months ago, coinciding with strange calls that ended when he entered rooms, unexplained absences, and passwords changed on their shared accounts. I've already started packing, she said, her voice honeyed with anticipation. The presidential suite has its own private deck. Did you update our insurance policies? Ronald asked casually, watching her eyes for the tell. The slight dilation that had given away her every lie since they'd met at a cybersecurity conference where he was speaking, and she was attending. There it was, a split-second flutter. All done, Celeste replied smoothly. They required medical exams for the adventure excursions, but I handled everything. Ronald nodded, calculating. The life insurance policy on him had quietly jumped from $2 million to $15 million 2 months ago. He'd discovered this 4 days earlier while searching for evidence of what his gut already knew. I have a meeting with Floyd tomorrow about the European expansion, he said. Floyd Matson was his oldest friend and CFO. Dinner reservations at Sorvino's after. Don't be too late, she said, kissing his cheek before retreating inside. Ronald turned back to the view, his reflection superimposed over the darkening horizon. The Ronald in the glass was already dead in Celeste's mind, but Celeste had forgotten the fundamental rule that had built his empire. Ronald Shaw always found the weakness in any system before others could exploit it. She's planning to kill you, Floyd said, placing his whiskey glass on the desk in Ronald's downtown office. That's what you're telling me. Ronald nodded, pulling up the evidence on his monitor. Location data from her phone showing weekly visits to a waterfront apartment registered to Jonas Ridley, a maritime security consultant they'd met at a charity gala. Text messages Ronald had recovered from cloud backups. The life insurance policy with its specific payout conditions. And you're sure about this Ridley guy? Floyd asked, his face grim beneath his gray crew cut. He specializes in marine accidents and investigations, Ronald replied. Previously worked for the Coast Guard, investigating drownings and disappearances at sea. Quite the convenient expertise. Go to the police, Floyd suggested, leaning forward. Ronald's smile was cold. And accomplish what? They'd have me file a report, question her, and then I'd have a wife who knows I'm onto her, but isn't behind bars. No evidence of an actual attempt. Then she'd cancel the cruise and regroup, try again when I'm not expecting it. Ronald moved to the window, looking down at the city grid below. No, I need to see this through. What are you planning? Floyd asked, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the privacy of the office. Ronald turned. I'm going to give my wife exactly what she wants. Her husband overboard on a cruise ship. Just not the one she's expecting. The Adriatic sun beat down on the pool deck of the Eternity Splendor as Ronald adjusted his sunglasses, watching Celeste laugh with the ship's cruise director. 5 days into their 14-day voyage, and his wife had been charming everyone. Crew members, fellow passengers, even Captain Solis at the welcome dinner. Everyone except him. When she thought he wasn't looking, the mask slipped. Her smiles faded, her eyes darted to her phone, and twice now, she had disappeared for hour-long spa appointments, that the ship's activity log showed she'd never attended. "Another mimosa, sir." A steward, Nelson, paused beside his lounger. "No, thank you," Ronald replied. He had made it his business to learn every crew member's name, to establish himself as the friendly, slightly knave husband who tipped well and asked about families back home. "Actually, have you worked on many Adriatic cruises?" 6 years now, sir," Nelson replied with pride. "Wonderful," Ronald said. "My wife was asking about tonight's route. Are we passing near any specific landmarks after dark?" Nelson brightened. "We'll be passing through the Gulf of Drakova around midnight. Many passengers miss it, but it's quite spectacular with the lights of Belmera and Montella on either side." "Perfect," Ronald said, slipping him a generous tip. "Our anniversary is tomorrow. Perhaps you could mention this to my wife when you see her. I'd like to surprise her with a midnight viewing on our balcony." "Of course, sir." "Excellent idea." Ronald watched Nelson walk away, then checked his custom-designed watch, the one with the hidden recording function he'd activated the moment they'd stepped aboard. His phone vibrated. A text from an encrypted app, sent by the private investigator he'd hired. "Confirmed meeting. Stateroom 8219. 35 minutes. Ronald stood, stretching casually. Stateroom 8219 was 4 decks down from their presidential suite, registered to an Adrian Lowe, the alias Jonas Ridley had used to book his passage. Ronald had learned this by accessing the ship's passenger manifest through a backdoor in the booking system. A vulnerability his company would have spotted in seconds if the cruise line had been a client. Instead, that vulnerability was now Ronald's advantage. He made his way to their suite, retrieving a small case from a hidden compartment in his luggage. Inside were 6 microscopic cameras and transmitters, products his company had developed for corporate security that had never reached the commercial market. Working quickly, he placed them strategically around the suite, focusing on the balcony where Nelson would helpfully suggest a romantic midnight viewing of the Gulf. Then he headed to Deck 4, his heart a metronome of controlled fury. "So it's happening tonight." Floyd's voice came through Ronald's earpiece as he sat in a quiet corner of the ship's library, tablet propped on his lap. "Yes," Ronald replied softly, angling himself away from an elderly couple browsing nearby shelves. On his tablet, the video feed showed Celeste and Jonas in fierce conversation in Jonas's stateroom. Ronald had placed a device on the corridor ceiling during a brief ship-wide power fluctuation his team had orchestrated from shore. Their words came through with crystal clarity. "The Gulf is perfect," Jonas was saying. 1,200-foot depth, strong currents. "By the time they realize he's missing, we'll be miles away." "You're sure it looks accidental?" Celeste asked, pacing nervously. "The Paulus. I've investigated dozens of cruise ship disappearances," Jonas replied confidently. "Drunk husband, dark night, high balcony rail. A cliché because it works. You just need to make sure he's had enough drinks." Celeste moved closer to Jonas, sliding her arms around his neck. "And afterward?" Jonas kissed her slowly before answering. "We wait 6 months, more appropriately. Then the grieving widow finds comfort in her husband's distant acquaintance. A year later, with $15 million in insurance money, we disappear to the property in New Zealand." "You getting all this?" Ronald asked Floyd. "Every word," his friend confirmed. "But Ronald, even with this evidence, it's still their word against yours if nothing happens. They could claim it was a fantasy, role play." "Which is why," Ronald said, closing the video feed as the couple finished their deadly planning with a passionate embrace, "something is going to happen tonight." Dusk settled over the ship as Ronald finished his preparations. The suite modifications were complete, an elaborate system of remote locks that would activate with one command from his phone. His meeting with the first officer had gone exactly as planned, with Ronald expressing concerns about his wife's supposed sleepwalking episodes. "More wine?" Celeste offered with a smile during their private dinner on their suite balcony. She'd been pouring generously all evening, watching carefully as Ronald seemingly drank glass after glass. What she didn't notice was the device in his sleeve that redirected most of each sip into a hidden compartment. A magician's trick he'd learned from a client who specialized in high-end corporate espionage training. "Delicious," he said, feigning a slight slur. "Did you bring the special bottle? The one from our wedding?" Something flickered in Celeste's eyes. Surprise that he remembered, guilt that she'd forgotten. But she covered quickly. "It's in my bag for tomorrow's anniversary." A lie. Their anniversary was 3 months ago. A test to see if she'd correct him. She hadn't. "How about a toast now?" he suggested, adding a deliberate wobble as he stood. "To us. To the future." Celeste hesitated, then smiled. "Why not? I'll get it." While she searched through her luggage, where no such bottle existed, Ronald activated the micro cameras throughout the suite and pressed a hidden button on his watch, signaling his shore team. Anyone monitoring the ship's GPS location would now see them precisely where Celeste and Jonas expected, approaching the Gulf of Drakova. In reality, the captain had subtly altered course an hour ago, following a navigational recommendation from maritime authorities, actually Ronald's own team. They were now passing through a different, wider channel with completely different rescue jurisdictions. "I can't find it," Celeste said, returning to the balcony with a frown. "Maybe I packed it in the other bag." "No matter," Ronald waved drunkenly, nearly knocking over his glass for effect. "This is good too." As expected, there was a knock at the door. "Nelson, right on schedule." "Mr. Shaw," the steward's voice called. "A quick reminder about tonight's Gulf passage. It should be visible from your balcony in about an hour." "Thank you, Nelson," Ronald called back with exaggerated cheer. Celeste's expression shifted, alert, calculating. She checked her phone, then smiled at Ronald. "How wonderful. We should stay up to see it." "Absolutely," he agreed, stumbling slightly as he rose. "Need to use the restroom first." Too much wine. In the bathroom, Ronald removed a small case from behind the ventilation panel where he'd hidden it earlier. Inside was a synthetic skin disguise, another proprietary technology from his company's government contracts division. The face that looked back at him from the mirror minutes later belonged to Jonas Ridley, right down to the small scar above his right eyebrow. While the disguise said, he sent the text he composed hours earlier from a clone of Celeste's phone. "I'll push him overboard tonight. The life insurance is $15 million. Meet me at the service stairs afterward. Bring cash and passports." Jonas would receive this just before midnight, believing it came from Celeste. Meanwhile, Ronald had already switched their cabin door numbers, a simple matter with tools and replacement placards. Anyone heading to the presidential suite would now arrive at the adjacent junior suite, vacant but identical in layout, which Ronald had gained access to through the ship's compromised booking system. At 11:50 p.m., Ronald Shaw disappeared into the service corridor, leaving behind his intoxicated wife on the balcony, staring impatiently at the sea. At 11:58 p.m., Jonas Ridley emerged onto the deck below, positioning himself by the railing. At midnight, Celeste's phone chimed with a message seemingly from Jonas. "Ready when you are. He's drunk enough." And at 12:03 a.m., ship security cameras captured Celeste Shaw slipping from her suite and moving swiftly down the service stairs to the lower deck, where a figure stood by the railing, back turned, looking out at the dark water. "Jonas," she whispered, approaching cautiously. The figure turned slightly, profile visible in the dim light. "Everything set." She moved closer. Ronald's practically passed out on the balcony. "I'll bring him out for air, then, over the rail. You have the statement prepared for security." "Everything's ready," the Jonas-faced figure confirmed. "The insurance company won't question a thing." Celeste stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I can't wait to be rid of him. His controlling, perfectionist routine, his suspicion of everyone. I've been suffocating for years. Just a few more minutes." Disguised Ronald sensed rather than saw her movement. The shift of weight, the subtle intake of breath before action. Years of martial arts training took over as he pivoted, ducking at the precise moment. Celeste lunged forward, hands outstretched to shove him overboard. Her momentum carried her against the railing. Ronald straightened, watching her eyes widen in shock as she teetered on the edge. "You?" she gasped, recognition dawning as she saw through the disguise to the eyes beneath, the eyes of the husband she had planned to murder. Ronald said nothing, making no move to either push or save her. He simply watched, impassive, as she struggled to regain her balance. At that moment, the real Jonas Ridley burst onto the deck, responding to the text he believed came from Celeste. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, seeing Celeste hanging half over the railing and a version of himself standing nearby. His confusion was all it took. Jonas rushed forward, intent on pulling Celeste to safety. In his haste, he collided with her, and the combined momentum sent them both over the edge. Their screams were swallowed by the wind and waves before the emergency alarms began to wail. "Mr. Shaw, please accept our deepest condolences for your loss," Captain Solis said, sitting across from Ronald in his office as the ship steamed back toward the coordinates where Celeste and Jonas had gone overboard. "The search and rescue operation is ongoing, but I must prepare you for the possibility that my wife is gone," Ronald finished, his face a mask of appropriate shock and grief. "I understand, Captain. Can you explain once more what happened?" asked Lieutenant Moreno from the Arcadian Coast Patrol, who had been helicoptered aboard. "You were in your suite when she fell." Ronald nodded, eyes downcast. "I'd had too much to drink with dinner. I fell asleep on the balcony lounger. When I woke up around midnight, Celeste was gone." His voice cracked convincingly. "I thought she might have gone for a walk. Then the alarm started. And you had no knowledge she was meeting this man, Jonas Ridley?" Lieutenant Moreno asked. "None," Ronald whispered. "I'd only met him once at a charity event months ago. I had no idea he was even on this ship." Captain Solis and the lieutenant exchanged glances. "Sir," the lieutenant said carefully, "the witness statements are concerning. 3 passengers reported seeing your wife attempt to push Mr. Ridley overboard before they both fell. And Mr. Ridley's stateroom contained items suggesting they knew each other quite well." Ronald allowed his expression to crumble further, like a man learning of betrayal on top of tragedy. "Are you saying my wife and this man were—" He didn't finish the sentence. "We believe they were having an affair, yes," Captain Solis confirmed gently. "There's also the matter of Mr. Ridley's identity. Our preliminary check shows he previously served with maritime law enforcement, specializing in shipboard accidents." "I don't understand," Ronald said, injecting confusion into his voice. "Why would Celeste try to push him overboard if they were involved?" Lieutenant Moreno's face hardened slightly. "That's what we're trying to determine, Mr. Shaw, particularly given the substantial life insurance policy recently taken out on your life." Ronald's performance was flawless. The shocked husband hearing of his wife's betrayal and possible murderous intent for the first time. By the time search operations were called off 48 hours later, the narrative had solidified. Celeste Shaw and her lover had plotted to murder Ronald for insurance money, but something had gone wrong during their attempt. The ship docked in Cerveno, where Ronald was interviewed extensively by the local authorities before being allowed to fly home to Harbridge. By then, the investigation had expanded dramatically. 7 bodies, Detective Harriet Fields said, sliding photographs across the conference room table at Harbridge Police Headquarters 1 week later. All women between 28 and 35, all found in industrial freezers in a storage facility rented by Jonas Ridley under an alias. Ronald stared at the images, genuinely shocked despite having orchestrated the chain of events that led to this discovery. When he crafted his plan, he'd known of Jonas's suspicious past, the unexplained resignations from maritime agencies, the restraining orders from 2 ex-girlfriends. But serial murder had not been on his radar. "We'd never have found them if not for your information about his finances," Detective Fields continued. "The account transfers between your wife and Ridley led us to his other identities. I still can't believe Celeste was involved with. Ronald gestured at the photos, letting revulsion show on his face. Field studied him carefully. We don't believe she knew about his other activities. The evidence suggests their relationship began approximately 8 months ago. The first victim disappeared 3 years ago. Do you think she really meant to? Ronald left the question hanging. Kill you, Fields finished bluntly. The evidence is compelling. Text messages, the insurance policy, the witness statements from the ship. If they'd succeeded, you'd have been victim number 8, just with a different modus operandi. Floyd had arranged for Ronald to have the best criminal attorney in Harbridge present during all police interviews, but it had proven unnecessary. Every piece of evidence pointed away from him and toward the narrative he'd constructed. We'll need you to remain available for further questions, Fields said, gathering the photographs. But at this point, you're not a suspect in any way. In fact, you're lucky to be alive, Mr. Shaw. That's what everyone keeps telling me, Ronald replied quietly. 3 months after the cruise, Ronald stood in the marble lobby of Shaw Security Solutions, watching as workmen installed a new company logo. The building around him hummed with activity. Engineers developing new systems, sales teams closing deals, PR representatives handling the flood of interest that came after his story hit the national news. Sympathy for the betrayed husband who had narrowly escaped death translated into the biggest quarter in company history. The Goldman contract is signed, Floyd announced, joining him by the windows. They're implementing our systems in all their international offices by year's end. Ronald nodded absently, his focus elsewhere. Still thinking about the lawsuit, Floyd asked more quietly. Ronald's mouth tightened. Despite the mountain of evidence against Celeste and Jonas, Celeste's family, led by her sister Nadia Farnsworth, had filed a wrongful death suit against him 3 weeks earlier, claiming he had somehow orchestrated the events on the cruise. They demanded half his assets and challenged the insurance company's refusal to pay out the policy on Celeste's life. Let them waste their money, Ronald replied. They have nothing. That journalist is still sniffing around, Floyd warned. Henrietta Cole. She's been interviewing crew members from the ship, asking about your behavior during the cruise. Ronald had anticipated this. She's welcome to investigate. Everything I told the police and media is completely true. It was his particular talent, constructing situations where he never had to lie outright. He had been in his suite when Celeste disappeared. He had awakened to alarms. He genuinely hadn't known Jonas Ridley was a serial killer. The fact that he'd manipulated events leading to those truths was unprobable. Sir, his assistant interrupted, approaching with a tablet in hand. Miss Cole is in the lobby, demanding to see you. Security is asking how to proceed. Ronald exchanged glances with Floyd. Send her up. Let's hear what she thinks she knows. Henrietta Cole did not look like the hardened investigative journalist who had exposed 3 corrupt senators and a human trafficking ring. With her pixie haircut and delicate features, she appeared barely out of college. But her eyes, sharp, assessing, gave her away as she took the seat across from Ronald in his office. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Mr. Shaw, she began, placing a recorder on the desk between them. Most men in your position would hide behind lawyers. I have nothing to hide, Miss Cole, Ronald replied evenly. And please, call me Ronald. All right. Ronald, she said, activating the recorder. Let's talk about the night your wife died. You claimed you were asleep in your suite. I was. The toxicology report confirmed the level of alcohol in my system. Yes, and yet ship security cameras show you perfectly steady on your feet 20 minutes earlier, when you visited the purser's office to report your missing cufflinks. Ronald allowed a small smile. I have a remarkably high tolerance. Ask anyone who knows me. I can seem perfectly functional and then crash completely. Convenient, Henrietta noted. Almost as convenient as the cabin number switch that several passengers reported. Apparently, the presidential suite was briefly labeled as a junior suite that night. I reported that to ship security the next morning. Ronald countered smoothly. Vandalism happens even on luxury cruises. Perhaps someone thought it was a prank. Henrietta leaned forward. You know what I find most interesting? Your company specializes in security vulnerabilities. The ship's computer system experienced glitches during the cruise, and you just happened to be on the same ship as your wife's lover, with both of them falling overboard after supposedly plotting to kill you. You're suggesting I somehow arranged all this? Ronald asked, injecting the perfect note of incredulity into his voice. Orchestrated my wife's affair with a man who turned out to be a serial killer. I'm suggesting, Henrietta replied carefully, that a man with your resources and knowledge of security systems could have discovered the affair, learned about the plot against you, and set a trap that resulted in both their deaths while appearing completely innocent. Ronald stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. My wife was plotting to kill me with her lover. I only survived because I was unconscious from alcohol when she tried to push me overboard. Instead, she and her accomplice somehow went over the rail themselves. And now her family is suing me, while journalists are trying to paint me as some mastermind villain. He shook his head. The truth is far simpler and sadder. I failed to see the woman I married was capable of murder. Henrietta studied him, clearly unsatisfied but unable to poke holes in his narrative. Anything else, Miss Cole? He asked quietly. She gathered her recorder. Just one thing. The ship's first officer mentioned you spoke to him about your wife's supposed history of sleepwalking, a condition her family and friends say she never had. Why make up something like that? For the first time, Ronald appeared genuinely surprised. A small miscalculation he hadn't anticipated coming to light. I never said she had a history of sleepwalking, he replied smoothly. I mentioned I was concerned she might be sleepwalking on the cruise, after finding her on the balcony one night, disoriented. Perhaps the officer misunderstood. Henrietta's eyes narrowed slightly. Perhaps. After she left, Floyd entered, his expression worried. That woman's dangerous. She's thorough, Ronald corrected. But without evidence, all she has is speculation. And if she finds evidence, Ronald turned to the windows, gazing out at the city. There is none to find. She's publishing tomorrow, Floyd said, pacing Ronald's living room 6 weeks later. Cole's editor confirmed it. The perfect murder. How Ronald Shaw got away with orchestrating his wife's death at sea. Ronald remained calm, watching the sunset from the same balcony, where he'd first confirmed Celeste's betrayal. On what evidence? That's just it, Floyd replied, pouring himself a generous scotch. She claims to have found a witness, someone from the ship who can place you on the lower deck near where Celeste and Jonas went overboard. This was unexpected. Ronald had accounted for every security camera, every crew member's position. Who? They're not saying. But the magazine's lawyers wouldn't have cleared it without something substantial. Ronald's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The screen showed an unknown number. He answered, Ronald Shaw. Mr. Shaw, this is Henrietta Cole, came the tight voice on the line. I thought you deserved a courtesy call before my story runs tomorrow. How thoughtful, Ronald replied dryly. I understand you're claiming to have a witness who saw me near the incident. A moment of silence. Yes, a cabin steward who was servicing the storage closet on that deck. He saw you in the corridor minutes before your wife and Jonas Ridley went overboard. Ronald processed this. That's fascinating, he said calmly. Particularly since I was in my suite, as the ship's computer records of my keycard usage confirm. Keycards can be used by anyone, Henrietta countered. And interestingly, our digital forensics expert found anomalies in the ship's security logs for that night. Sections missing or corrupted. Exactly the kind of traces left by someone hacking a system. Sounds like you've built quite the conspiracy theory, Ronald observed. I look forward to seeing what your lawyers allowed you to publish. One more thing, Mr. Shaw, Henrietta added, her voice hardening. We found the specialist who created your prosthetic facial disguise. He's agreed to testify that you commissioned a Jonas Ridley mask 3 weeks before the cruise. Ronald let the line go silent as he processed this true and serious threat. The disguise expert, Roberto Velasquez, had been paid in untraceable cryptocurrency through multiple proxies, and Ronald had considered him the one loose end. It seemed he'd miscalculated. "Mr. Shaw," Henrietta prompted after the extended pause. "Cole," Ronald finally replied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Publishing false allegations against me would be a serious mistake for both you and your magazine." "Are you threatening me?" Henrietta sounded more intrigued than intimidated. "Not at all. Simply stating facts. My attorneys will be in touch. Good evening." He ended the call and turned to Floyd, whose face had gone pale. "We need to implement contingency protocol," Ronald said quietly. "Now." The explosion at Henrietta Cole's apartment building occurred at 3:17 a.m., a gas line rupture, according to first responders. The fire spread to 3 floors, forcing emergency evacuation of 28 residents. Henrietta Cole was not among them. When firefighters finally reached her unit, they found her unconscious from smoke inhalation, clutched protectively around an external hard drive and a file box. Both she and her evidence survived. The same could not be said for Roberto Velasquez, the special effects artist, whose car plunged off Ocean View Highway that same night. The body never recovered from the churning waters below. By morning, Detective Fields was at Ronald's door with a search warrant and a team of officers. "This is harassment," Ronald's attorney protested, as police methodically moved through the penthouse. "This is a murder investigation," Fields replied coldly. "Attempted murder of Henrietta Cole and the confirmed death of Roberto Velasquez, both key witnesses in the case against your client." Ronald maintained his composed demeanor. "I was here all night. My building security and cameras will confirm that." "Yes," Fields said, "just like ship security confirmed you were in your suite when your wife went overboard." Funny how technology always seems to back your stories while witnesses end up dead, or nearly so. "Detective," Ronald's attorney interrupted sharply, "unless you're formally charging my client, this line of questioning ends now." Fields studied Ronald with undisguised suspicion. "We'll be monitoring all your communications and movements from now on, Mr. Shaw. One misstep, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison." "I understand your frustration, Detective," Ronald replied with perfect sincerity. "You want justice for Celeste and the others. So do I." After the police departed with his computers and phones, Ronald turned to his attorney. "They have nothing admissible," the lawyer assured him. "Cole's witness is circumstantial at best. The effects artist is gone, without direct evidence linking you to either incident last night. They're fishing." Ronald nodded, already calculating his next moves. The contingency protocol was designed for exactly this scenario. Evidence eliminated, alternate explanations established, distance created between himself and necessary actions. Floyd would have already initiated the secondary measures. "What about the data from Velasquez's cloud storage?" he asked. "Our team is still trying to crack the encryption," Floyd replied. "If he stored evidence of your commission there, it could surface any time." Ronald placed his tablet down carefully. "Then we need to change the narrative." "How?" The jury looked skeptical. "The media is calling you the cruise ship killer." "And by giving them a better villain," Ronald interrupted. "And I know exactly who it should be." The next morning, Detective Fields received an anonymous package containing a USB drive. The cybersecurity department spent 24 hours verifying it contained no malware before allowing her to view the contents. What she found changed everything. Email exchanges between Jonas Ridley and Floyd Matson dating back 14 months, financial transfers, detailed discussions of Ronald's schedule, his marriage, his vulnerabilities. The final message, sent 2 days before the cruise, was damning. "Everything's in place. C believes the plan is hers. Once R is eliminated, the company restructure gives us controlling interest. Stick to the timeline." Fields stared at the evidence, pieces realigning in her mind. Floyd Matson, Ronald's oldest friend and CFO, had been the puppet master, manipulating Jonas, who in turn had manipulated Celeste, all to gain control of Shaw Security after Ronald's death. If true, Ronald had been the intended victim all along, not the mastermind. Floyd Matson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and evidence tampering. The arrest at Shaw Security headquarters became instant national news. Camera crews captured the CFO being led out in handcuffs, ashen-faced and silent. Within hours, the narrative of the cruise ship case underwent a seismic shift. Ronald expressed shock and betrayal in a carefully worded press statement. To learn that my closest friend and colleague conspired with my wife to end my life for financial gain is devastating beyond words. I've cooperated fully with authorities and will continue to do so as this painful chapter unfolds. In the courtroom, Celeste's family's lawsuit collapsed as their attorneys scrambled to regroup. The judge granted a continuance, but the damage was done. Public sentiment swung decisively in Ronald's favor. The betrayed husband, doubly victimized by wife and best friend, wrongly suspected because he had survived their plot. Only Henrietta Cole remained unconvinced. This is too convenient, she insisted to Detective Fields in the detective's office. The evidence against Matson appears just when Shaw needs it most. After months of nothing, it suddenly surfaces. Detective Fields looked exhausted. The case had consumed her life for nearly a year. The emails were authenticated by 3 independent experts. The financial transfers are documented. Matson's offshore accounts match what was promised to Ridley in their exchanges. Planted, Henrietta argued. All of it. Shaw has the technical expertise to create undetectable forgeries. And what would be his motive now? Fields countered. If he orchestrated his wife's death, why implicate Matson afterward? Why not just let Celeste and Ridley take the blame, as he originally set up? Henrietta paced the small office. Because I was getting too close. Because the civil trial was turning against him. Because he needed a new villain when the old one wasn't working anymore. Fields sighed. Without evidence, Cole. That's just a theory. Meanwhile, Matson's not denying the communications with Ridley, his lawyers already floating an immunity deal for testimony. Because Shaw got to him too, Henrietta insisted. Promised him protection, reduced charges, financial security for his family if he takes the fall. But even as she spoke, Henrietta recognized the futility of her position. With Matson's arrest, the official narrative had solidified around Ronald as the victim. Her editor had permanently shelved her exposé, citing liability concerns. Her sources had gone silent. Floyd Matson sat across from Ronald Shaw in the prison visiting room, separated by plexiglass. 2 months had passed since his arrest, and the former CFO looked diminished, his confident bearing replaced by nervous vigilance. Is it done? Floyd asked quietly, conscious of recording devices. Ronald nodded almost imperceptibly. The arrangements for your family are complete. The offshore account is funded. Your wife has the instructions for accessing it after your sentencing. Relief washed over Floyd's face. And the reduced charges. The prosecutor will offer manslaughter with possibility of parole in 7 years, Ronald confirmed. Accepted immediately. 7 years, Floyd murmured, calculating. My youngest will be in college when I get out. With a trust fund that would make Midas envious, Ronald added. You're saving your own life. Floyd. If this went to trial with the evidence they have, it would be life without parole. The evidence Ronald had meticulously created over months, building a digital trail between Floyd and Jonas piece by piece, fabricating backdated communications, constructing the financial connections, was a masterpiece of technological deception that had survived expert scrutiny. Floyd met his gaze. Fields still suspects you. Without evidence, Ronald said. Suspicion is meaningless. And Cole. Ronald's expression hardened slightly. No longer a concern. 2 days earlier, Henrietta Cole had received a job offer from an international news organization, a position in their Osaka bureau covering Asian technology developments. an opportunity too prestigious to decline. Created through Ronald's connections and funded via proxies that could never be traced back to him. Distance was often more effective than elimination. Henrietta would be halfway around the world. Her credibility on the Shaw case diminished by Floyd's confession. Her audience would be unreceptive to conspiracy theories about a man now widely viewed as a victim. "When this is over," Ronald said, rising as the guard indicated their time was up, "remember our agreement. Complete silence buys your family security for life." Floyd nodded, the weight of his choice evident in his slumped shoulders. "Was any of it real?" "Our friendship." Ronald paused. Considering the man who had been his closest confidant for 20 years, the man who had stood beside him as he built his empire, the man who had never actually betrayed him in reality, only in the elaborate fiction Ronald had constructed to save himself. "You were the only person I ever truly trusted," Ronald answered truthfully. "That's why it had to be you." 1 year after the fateful cruise, Ronald Shaw stood on the observation deck of his new yacht, larger and more luxurious than the vessel that had changed his life. Harbridge Bay glittered below as guests in formal attire mingled on the expansive deck, celebrating the launch of Shaw Security's revolutionary new cybersecurity platform. The company had not only recovered from the scandal, but had emerged stronger. The narrative of its founder surviving betrayal and murder attempts had become corporate legend, burnishing Ronald's reputation as a man impossible to deceive or defeat. Stock values had tripled. Government contracts poured in. Mr. Shaw, his new executive assistant, Adelaide, interrupted his thoughts. "So sorry to disturb you, but your speech is scheduled in 5 minutes." Ronald turned to find Adelaide holding her tablet, poised for final instructions. He'd hired her 6 months earlier. Highly competent, professional, and with no connections to the tumultuous past. "Thank you, Adelaide," he said. "I'll be right there." As she departed, Ronald took a final moment alone, surveying what he'd preserved and what he'd sacrificed. Celeste and Jonas were gone, their bodies never recovered from the Adriatic. Floyd was serving his sentence at a minimum security facility, his family financially secure for generations. Henrietta Cole was building a successful career in Osaka, her interest in the Shaw case fading as new stories demanded her attention. Detective Fields had officially closed the investigation following Floyd's confession and sentencing. Celeste's family had withdrawn their lawsuit after a modest settlement that included non-disclosure agreements. Ronald had emerged not just intact, but victorious. His empire was stronger than ever. His reputation had transformed from successful businessman to mythic figure, a man who had survived a conspiracy worthy of a thriller novel. Yet victory had cost him the only things he had ever truly valued: trust and loyalty. Everyone close to him had been sacrificed or removed. He stood alone at the summit he had defended so ruthlessly. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced as Ronald approached the main deck, "please welcome the founder and CEO of Shaw Security Solutions, Ronald Shaw." Applause erupted as he took the podium. The assembled industry leaders, politicians, and media figures hanging on his every word. "A year ago," Ronald began, his voice steady and commanding, "I learned a painful lesson about vulnerability, about betrayal from those closest to us, about systems we believe are secure until they're breached from within." The crowd grew silent, captivated. That experience taught me that true security isn't about building impenetrable walls. It's about constructing systems that survive even when trusted elements turn hostile. It's about planning for betrayal as a certainty, not a possibility. He continued unveiling the new security platform that would revolutionize corporate and government protection. As he spoke, Ronald reflected on the true innovation that had saved him: his ability to see the fatal flaws in any system, including his marriage, and act decisively to eliminate threats before they could eliminate him. Later that night, after the guests had departed, and the yacht cut through the darkness toward his private dock, Ronald stood alone at the stern. The Harbridge skyline receded behind him, lights glittering like the stars that had witnessed Celeste's final moments. His phone chimed with a notification from the company's secure server. There was a potential vulnerability in the new platform. Minor but potentially significant if exploited by the right adversary. Ronald smiled faintly as he began analyzing the report. This was the world he understood. Systems with weaknesses that could be identified and eliminated. A perfect, controllable order where nothing was left to chance and no betrayal went unpunished. He had survived the deepest betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger. The vulnerability in his new system would be addressed by morning, patches deployed, breaches prevented, just as he had patched the vulnerability named Celeste, and the one named Floyd, and all the others who had threatened what he built. In Ronald Shaw's world, threats were identified, neutralized, and discarded. Always, without exception, without mercy. And he would never, ever forgive.